In 1894, a former Bureau of American Ethnology field agent named Cornelius Vance was found dead in a boarding house in Alexandria, Virginia. The coroner ruled it heart failure. He was 41 years old. 3 days before he died, he mailed 17 pages of handwritten notes to a newspaper editor in Cincinnati. Those notes never arrived. They were intercepted, logged into a federal record system, and locked inside a storage vault in Washington. They have never been declassified. Vance had spent 11 years walking the Mound country of Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Tennessee. He had personally measured over 400 earthen mounds. He had catalogued the contents of 93 of them. And in the spring of 1893, his superiors at the Bureau ordered him to do one thing: sign a document, reclassify the bones. He refused. This is the story of the last ethnology agent who refused to reclassify the mound bones, and what he said before dying. Before we go any further, hit subscribe. We dig into the buried files of American history every week, not the version they teach in school, the version they buried. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. To understand what Vance was actually asked to do, you have to understand the institution he worked for. The Bureau of American Ethnology was created by an act of Congress in 1879. Its first director was John Wesley Powell, the same man who led the first government expedition down the Colorado River. Powell convinced lawmakers that the United States needed a permanent body of researchers to study, document, and classify every indigenous culture inside its borders. He told them the work would be scientific. He told them it would be neutral. He told them the Bureau would simply record what was there. That is not what the Bureau actually did. By the time Vance was hired in 1882, the Bureau had already taken a position. The mounds of the American interior, which numbered in the tens of thousands, were the work of ancestral Native American tribes. There had never been a vanished race of mound builders. There had never been giants. There had never been anything in those mounds that could not be explained by ordinary Algonquian, Siouan, or Iroquoian construction. That was the official line. That was the line every agent was hired to confirm. Vance was 29 years old when he signed his contract. He had a degree from Oberlin College in Ohio. He had spent 2 summers working with a railroad survey crew through the Ohio River Valley. He had seen the Great Grave Creek Mound in West Virginia. He had stood on the platform of the Great Serpent Mound. He had walked the geometric earthworks of Newark. He believed at the start of his career that the Bureau wanted the truth. He took the job because he wanted to be the man who delivered it. His first assignment was in Adams County, Ohio, near the headwaters of Brush Creek. He spent 4 months there. He excavated 3 small mounds and 1 larger conical mound near the bend of the creek. What he found in that 4th mound is on record in a partial report dated November 1882. The original 10-page report was reduced to 4 pages by his supervisor before submission to Washington. The 4-page version is publicly available. The original 10-page version was never seen again. In the partial report, Vance documented the recovery of a single human skeleton. The skeleton was lying on a stone slab. Around the neck was a copper plate, hammered thin, with markings on it. Vance described the markings as, quote, characters, possibly alphabetic, of no language known to me, end quote. The skull was elongated at the back. The femur was measured at 21.5 inches. For comparison, the average human femur measures between 17 and 19 inches. That single sentence about the femur was removed from the public version of the report. So was the description of the copper plate. So was the word characters. The published report described, quote, a burial of an adult male of indeterminate age, end quote, and nothing more. Vance was 29 years old. He had been working for the Bureau for less than a year. He noticed the edits. He said nothing. By 1884, Vance had completed surveys in 8 Ohio counties and 4 Kentucky counties. He had excavated partially or fully 27 mounds. He had filed 27 reports. Every single one of them had been edited before submission. The pattern was consistent. Anything describing skeletal remains as unusually large was removed. Anything describing copper, silver, or worked metal objects with markings on them was removed. Anything describing burial chambers built with cut stone, mortared brick, or what Vance once called, quote, architecture, inconsistent with mound culture, end quote, was removed. He started keeping a second set of notes. The second set of notes was never submitted to the Bureau. He wrote them at night in his lodging house, in a small leather-bound journal he carried in his coat. He did this for 9 years. By the end of his career, he had filled 4 journals. None of those journals have ever been recovered, but we know what was in them. We know because of one man, a printer in Cincinnati named Albert Rees. Rees received a letter from Vance in March of 1894. The letter included transcribed excerpts from the journals. Rees kept the letter for the rest of his life. He gave it to his grandson in 1947. His grandson donated it to a private historical society in Ohio in 1981. The full text of the letter has been examined by 3 independent researchers. The text matches the formal handwriting samples of Cornelius Vance on file at Oberlin College. The letter is the only surviving record of what Vance saw in the field over 11 years. In the letter, Vance described 41 separate excavations in which he recovered human skeletal remains that did not match the proportions of any known indigenous population. He described skeletons measuring 7 feet, 7.5 feet, and in 2 cases, over 8 feet from heel to crown. He described double rows of teeth on 3 separate skulls. He described skulls with no frontal suture. He described one skeleton, recovered from a mound in Brush Creek Township in 1887, that had what he called, quote, a copper helmet, hammered to the shape of the skull and corroded into the bone itself, end quote. He also described inscriptions. According to the letter, Vance personally recovered or examined 11 artifacts bearing what he described as written symbols. Some were on copper plates, some were on stone slabs, one was carved into the underside of a slate burial cover. He noted that the symbols repeated. He noted that some of them resembled, quote, the writing of the ancient Mediterranean, but not exactly, end quote. He noted that he had attempted, on his own time and at his own expense, to find a scholar who could read them. He had not succeeded. In the spring of 1890, Vance travelled to Washington for what was supposed to be a routine annual review. He met with Cyrus Thomas, who was then the director of the Bureau's Division of Mound Exploration. Thomas was 65 years old. He had been hired by Powell in 1881 specifically to settle, in his words, the mound builder question once and for all. Thomas had already settled it, at least on paper. In 1894, he would publish a 1,200-page report concluding that all mounds in the United States were built by the direct ancestors of contemporary Native American tribes, and that no vanished race had ever existed in North America. The report became the official position of the United States government. It is still cited as the foundational document of American mound archaeology. In 1890, 4 years before the report was published, Cyrus Thomas sat across a desk from Cornelius Vance and asked him to sign a preliminary memorandum. The memorandum stated that no skeletal remains recovered by Bureau agents exceeded ordinary human proportions. It stated that no inscribed artifacts of pre-Columbian origin had been recovered. It stated that no construction techniques inconsistent with known indigenous practice had been documented. Vance read the memorandum. He set it down on the desk. He told Thomas he could not sign it. He told Thomas the document was inaccurate. According to Vance's letter to Albert Rees, Thomas did not become angry. Thomas did not argue. Thomas simply said, quote, "You will sign it eventually," end quote, and asked Vance to leave the office. Vance left Washington that night. He returned to Ohio. He continued his fieldwork. For the next 3 years, his reports were no longer edited. They were no longer submitted at all. Vance would file a report and receive no acknowledgement. He would send a follow-up letter and receive no response. He began to suspect, correctly, that his employment had become a formality. In December of 1892, his pay was reduced by half. In February of 1893, it was stopped entirely. No letter of termination was ever sent. No formal dismissal was ever filed. Cornelius Vance simply ceased to be paid. He kept working anyway. He spent the spring of 1893 in Mound City, Ohio, on the Scioto River. He had no funding, no assistant, and no formal authority to excavate. He worked alone, he paid for his own supplies, he slept in a tent. According to his letter, he opened 2 small mounds in that period. In one of them he recovered the remains of what he described as, quote, a man of 7 feet 6 inches, buried in a sitting position with a sheet of beaten copper across his chest, bearing 9 distinct characters, end quote. He removed the copper sheet. He took it back to his tent. He copied the characters onto a sheet of paper. He folded the paper and placed it inside the lining of his coat. That paper was never recovered. In June of 1893, Vance received a visit from a man he did not recognize. The man identified himself as a representative of the Department of the Interior. He told Vance that the Bureau of American Ethnology was prepared to offer him a new position, with full back pay restored in exchange for his cooperation on a single document. The document was the same memorandum Thomas had presented in 1890, now revised and expanded. Vance was being asked to certify, on the record, that everything he had personally documented over 11 years of fieldwork had been a misinterpretation. He was being asked to reclassify the bones as ordinary. He was being asked to reclassify the artifacts as decorative. He was being asked to reclassify the architecture as conventional. He was being asked in writing to lie. He refused. The man from the Department of the Interior did not threaten him. According to Vance's letter, the man simply nodded, took the unsigned memorandum back, and said, quote, "That will be all, Mr. Vance," end quote. Vance returned to his tent in Mound City. He worked through the rest of the summer. In September, he traveled to Cincinnati to deliver a lecture to the Western Historical Society. The lecture was cancelled the day before he was scheduled to speak. The Society's president told him in person that pressure had been received from Washington and the booking could not be honoured. In October, his tent was searched while he was away. 2 of his journals were missing when he returned. He moved his remaining journals into a locked metal box buried 50 yards from his campsite. He continued his work. He had no income, no institutional support, and no way to publish what he was finding. He kept going anyway. There is a passage in the letter that deserves to be read carefully here. Vance wrote about the symbols on the copper plates. He had been trying for nearly a decade to find someone who could read them. He had written to professors at Harvard, at Yale, and at the University of Pennsylvania. He had written to museum curators in New York and Boston. He had written to a linguist in Berlin. Most of his letters were never answered. The few that were answered told him that the symbols he was describing did not match any known script, and were probably random decorative marks made by tribesmen who could not write. Vance did not accept this. In the letter to Rees, he described the symbols as falling into 3 distinct groups. The first group resembled simplified pictographs. The second group resembled angular letter forms with horizontal and vertical strokes only, similar in structure to the runic alphabets of Northern Europe, but matching no specific runic system he could identify. The third group was the one that troubled him the most. It consisted of curved characters arranged in repeating sequences. He believed the third group was not a decorative pattern. He believed it was a written language with grammatical structure. He believed it had been used by the people buried in the mounds to record information. He also wrote, in a passage that has been studied carefully by every researcher who has read the letter, that several of the inscribed objects he recovered showed evidence of being older than the surrounding mound structure. The objects were buried inside the mounds, but the corrosion patterns, the patina of the copper, and in 2 cases the calcification of stone fragments adhering to the artifacts, suggested that the items had existed for a long period of time before being placed in the mounds. Vance did not draw a conclusion from this. He recorded it as an observation, but the implication, if his observation was accurate, was that the mounds were not the original context of the artifacts. The mounds were a later burial of something older. That is one of the most quietly significant claims in the entire letter. It suggests that the mound builders, whoever they were, had inherited materials from an even earlier population. It suggests layers. It suggests that the question of who built the mounds and the question of who made the objects inside the mounds were not the same question. Vance never had the chance to develop this idea further. He recorded it once, in 3 sentences, in the letter to Rees. Then he moved on. In January of 1894, Vance left Mound City and travelled to Alexandria, Virginia. We do not know exactly why he went there. The letter to Albert Rees suggests he was attempting to reach a former colleague at the Smithsonian, a man named only as J.H. in the letter, who had agreed to authenticate a sample of the copper inscriptions. The meeting may have taken place. We do not know. What we know is that on the 3rd of March, 1894, Cornelius Vance wrote his final letter. The full text of that letter, addressed to Albert Rees in Cincinnati, is what we have been quoting throughout this video. He wrote about the 11 years of field work. He wrote about the edited reports. He wrote about the meetings with Cyrus Thomas. He wrote about the visit from the Department of the Interior. He wrote about the missing journals, and at the end of the letter, he wrote a single paragraph that has become the most quoted passage in the entire surviving record. He wrote, and we are quoting directly from the letter now, quote, "I am not afraid of being wrong. I am afraid of being silent. There are bones in those mounds that belong to a people we have refused to name. There are letters carved on copper that we have refused to read. There are walls built of stone that we have refused to measure. The Bureau will publish its report this year, and the question will be closed. I have one voice, and it is small, but I am the last man in the service of this government who has stood in those chambers and seen what is there. If I do not say it now, no one will. So I will say it. The mound builders were not who we have been told they were. The bones are not what we have been told they are. And the men who know this have decided, for reasons I cannot fully name, that the American public is not to be told." End quote. That paragraph is the answer to the question this video began with. What he said before dying. That is what he said. He mailed the letter on the 4th of March. He died on the 7th. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure. He was 41. He had no documented history of heart disease. He had walked, by his own estimate, over 6,000 miles in the field over the course of his career. He had been examined by a bureau physician in 1891 and pronounced in excellent health. The coroner in Alexandria did not perform an autopsy. The body was claimed by a cousin and buried in a small cemetery in Marietta, Ohio. The grave is still there. The headstone reads only his name and his dates. There is no mention of his profession. The metal box buried 50 yards from his campsite in Mound City was never recovered. Multiple searches have been conducted by private researchers over the past century. The campsite location is approximately known. The box has never been found. The letter to Albert Rees is the only document that survived. Now we have to talk about what happened after he died. Cyrus Thomas published his report in December of 1894. It became the official position of the United States government and remains the standard reference work in mainstream American archaeology. The report mentions Cornelius Vance exactly once, in a footnote on page 847. The footnote refers to him as, quote, "a former agent whose field reports were determined to be of insufficient scientific rigor," end quote. That is the entire official record of his 11 years of work. The artifacts he recovered are another story. The Bureau of American Ethnology maintained a storage facility in the basement of the original Smithsonian Castle building. After 1894, that facility was expanded into 3 separate vaults located in different buildings on the National Mall. The records of what was transferred into those vaults are partial. The records of what was transferred out are almost non-existent. In 1909, a Smithsonian curator named Edwin Phillips submitted an internal request to examine the Vance collection. His request was approved. When he arrived at the vault, the curator on duty told him that the collection had been transferred. Phillips asked for the transfer paperwork. he was told it could not be located. Phillips made a written record of this exchange in his personal diary, which is held today by his descendants. The Vance collection has never been formally inventoried. The Smithsonian, when asked directly by researchers over the past several decades, has stated that no collection under that name exists in its current holdings. The institution is not lying. The collection was not held under that name. It was held, according to internal records that have partially surfaced, under a numerical designation only. What we know about that designation comes from a single source. A retired Smithsonian archivist named Margaret Holloway gave an interview to a private researcher in 1978. Holloway had worked in the institution's records division for 31 years. She had retired in 1976. In the interview, she stated that during the 1950s, she had personally processed paperwork related to the transfer of, quote, 12 crates of human skeletal material and associated artifacts, end quote, from a Smithsonian storage facility to a separate federal facility outside of Washington. She did not know where the material was sent. She did not know who authorized the transfer. She knew only that the crates were labeled with a numerical designation she remembered as beginning with the letters BAE, the Bureau of American Ethnology, the bureau that employed Cornelius Vance. Holloway died in 1984. The interview was published in a small circulation journal in 1986. The Smithsonian has never commented on it. This is not the only piece of supporting evidence. In the late 1990s, a Freedom of Information request was filed by an independent researcher seeking, quote, all records relating to the Bureau of American Ethnology Mound exploration program, agents employed between 1881 and 1894, end quote. The response indicated that the majority of internal records from that period had been transferred to the National Archives in 1965. A subsequent request to the National Archives produced approximately 400 pages of material. Cornelius Vance is mentioned in 9 of those pages. In every one of the 9 mentions, his name appears in connection with disciplinary correspondence. He is described as uncooperative. He is described as unreliable. He is described as a man whose field methods, quote, deviated from accepted scientific practice, end quote. No specific deviation is ever named. No specific incident is ever cited. He is simply described repeatedly as a problem. There is no mention of his findings. There is no mention of his reports. There is no mention of the meetings in Washington. There is no mention of the visit from the Department of the Interior. There is no mention of his death. The official paper trail of Cornelius Vance ends in 1893 with the cessation of his pay. The unofficial paper trail ends in 1894 with the letter to Albert Rees. Everything in between has been removed. We have to ask the obvious question. Why would the United States government in the late 19th century dedicate institutional resources to suppressing the work of a single field agent who claimed to have found large skeletons and inscribed copper plates in earthen mounds? Why does it matter? Who benefits from concealing this? The answer most commonly offered by the researchers who have studied this case is straightforward, and it has nothing to do with anti-Native American policy or with religious cosmology, which are the 2 explanations sometimes proposed. The answer has to do with land. In 1894, the United States was 30 years past the end of the Civil War and 40 years away from the closure of the western frontier. The federal government was in the middle of one of the largest land redistributions in human history. The Homestead Act, the Indian Allotment Acts, the railroad land grants, hundreds of millions of acres of land were being converted from indigenous, federal, or unclassified status into private ownership. The legal basis for that conversion rested on a specific historical claim. The claim was that the land had been used by nomadic indigenous peoples whose societies had not developed permanent settlements, written records, or claims of ownership in a form recognizable to European-derived law. This claim was used to justify the policy of allotment, the policy of removal, and the policy of unilateral congressional authority over indigenous lands. If the mounds of the American interior were the work of a literate, settled, architecturally sophisticated civilization, that claim collapsed. If the bones in the mounds belonged to a population that had built cities, written records, and held the land for thousands of years before the arrival of any tribe known to 19th century ethnographers, the entire legal scaffolding of westward expansion would have to be re-examined. It was easier to reclassify the bones. That is the argument. We are not telling you it is correct. We are telling you it is the argument that emerges from the surviving documents, including the letter from Cornelius Vance to Albert Rees. Vance himself never made this argument explicitly. He was, by training and by temperament, a field researcher. He recorded what he found. He measured what he saw. He did not write political analysis. He wrote inventories of mounds. But he understood by the end of his life that the inventories were the political analysis. He understood that the act of recording accurately and completely what was in those mounds was itself a threat to the institutional order of the country that had hired him. He understood that the order to reclassify was not a scientific request. It was a political instruction wearing scientific clothing. He refused it. That is the story. What does it mean for us more than a century later? The mounds are still there. The Serpent Mound in Adams County is now a state historical site. The Newark earthworks have been nominated for World Heritage status. Cahokia in Illinois draws tourists from around the world. The earthworks have not been hidden. They cannot be hidden. They are too large and too numerous to be hidden. What has been hidden is what came out of them. The artifacts collected by Bureau agents between 1881 and 1894 are not on public display. The skeletal remains are not on public display. The copper plates, the stone tablets, the inscribed slate covers, the worked metalwork that does not fit the official picture. None of it is in any museum that admits the public. Some of it may have been destroyed. Some of it may have been transferred to private collections. Some of it may still be in federal storage under designations that do not appear in any public catalogue. The case of Cornelius Vance is one case. There were others. There were at least 4 other agents who, between 1882 and 1895, filed reports that were either heavily edited or withdrawn entirely from the official record. Their names appear in passing references in surviving correspondence. None of them left a letter like the one Vance wrote to Albert Rees. None of them left a record we can read today. Vance was the last one. He was the last man in the official service of the Bureau of American Ethnology to put on paper what he had actually seen and to mail it before anyone could stop him. The letter reached Cincinnati on the 8th of March, 1894. Albert Rees opened it the following morning. He read it twice. He placed it in a sealed envelope inside his personal safe. He did not publish it. He did not show it to anyone. He told his wife, on the night he received it, that he believed the man who wrote it was already dead. He was correct. Vance had died the day before the letter arrived. Rees kept the letter for 53 years. He never made it public. He told his grandson, on his deathbed, that he had not published it because he was afraid. He believed until the end of his life that the men who had silenced Cornelius Vance were still in positions where they could silence others. He may have been right. He may have been wrong. We do not know what would have happened if he had published the letter in 1894. We know what happened because he did not. The Cyrus Thomas report became the official record. The mounds became, in the public mind, the work of ordinary peoples. The bones became, in the public mind, ordinary bones. The question was closed. It was not closed because the evidence supported the closure. It was closed because the evidence was removed before it could be examined. That is the part of the story that matters. That is the part you should remember. Cornelius Vance died in a boarding house in Alexandria, Virginia, on the 7th of March, 1894, 3 days after mailing a letter that the United States government did not want mailed. He was 41 years old. He had no wife and no children. He left behind no estate. The only thing he left behind that was not seized, edited, suppressed, or destroyed was a single letter to a printer in Cincinnati who was too afraid to publish it. That letter, more than a century later, is the only reason we know what he saw. He was the last ethnology agent who refused to reclassify the Mound bones. What he said before dying is what we have been telling you for the past 30 minutes. The bones are not what we have been told they are. The men who know this have decided that the American public is not to be told. Cornelius Vance said it in a letter on the 3rd of March 1894. He was right then. The evidence suggests he is still right today. The vaults are still locked. The crates are still missing. The collection still does not officially exist. If you want the institutions to open those vaults, the first step is to know what is in them. The first step is to know the names of the people who refuse to be silent. Cornelius Vance is one of those names. He is not the only one. We will be telling you the stories of the others in the videos that follow. There is one final detail worth sitting with. The boarding house where Vance died was on Prince Street in Alexandria, less than 2 miles across the river from the Smithsonian Castle, where his reports had been edited for 11 years. He had come within walking distance of the institution that had built its public reputation on the suppression of his work. He died in a rented room 6 blocks from a federal records office that, by the time he was buried, already contained the file documenting his refusal. He was that close. The full record of what was done to him was that close to being read by the public. It never was. The story is not over. It never closed. It only went quiet. That is the end of what we know about Cornelius Vance. The rest is in the vault.